Good morning and welcome to CSBA's webinar before the adoption, Creating the Conditions for a High-Quality Mathematics Program. This year, CSBA has, with the generous support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, developed a series of resources about instructional materials adoptions for school board members and governance teams, with a special focus on preparing for the new mathematics adoption. However, we at CSBA recognize that the work of supporting an effective adoption begins long before you are considering programs from the dais, and even before a pilot program is selected. So in today's webinar, we are pleased to bring you two California experts who are leading in helping California's county offices of education and school districts across the state prepare for this process. And they'll begin by sharing information about the importance of developing the conditions for a successful math adoption. Then they'll provide an overview of the structure and features and organizing concepts of the new California mathematics framework so that you have the background knowledge to help set your LEA's vision for implementation. And finally, because CSBA is particularly focused on supporting effective governance, they'll tie all of these pieces together by discussing how you as board members and members of governance teams can support the effective conditions so that you will be able to have a successful framework implementation and adoption. Before we begin, however, let's go over a few housekeeping details. So first of all, at the end of the presentation, we will have a question and answer segment where we will try our best to answer your questions. You're going to use the Q&A feature of Zoom to type your questions. This is located on the ribbon below the speaker. Your questions will be answered either in the Q&A panel, in writing, or live by our presenters, either during the presentation itself or at the Q&A at the end of our presentation. And as a reminder, all attendees and folks who have registered will receive a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as a copy of the slide deck. So to begin, I want to introduce our panelists to give you a little bit of a perspective. And I believe that Dr. Mike Torres is going to introduce our colleague, Ellen Barger.
Thank you so much, Mary, for setting the groundwork for this. I'd like to introduce Ellen Barger, our Associate Superintendent of Curriculum and Instruction at Santa Barbara County Office of Education. She's extremely busy, extremely knowledgeable about mathematics, extremely passionate about it, past chair of the Curricular and Improvement Support Committee, or CISC, of the California County Superintendents, and the current chair of the CISC Mathematics Subcommittee. In addition to that, she's the California Math Science, Computer Science, Mathematics lead for the Math Science and Computer Science Initiative.
And it's my opportunity to introduce my wonderful colleague, Dr. Mike Torres, who I've had the opportunity to work with over the past several years. Mike Torres is the Director of the Curriculum Frameworks and Instructional Resources Division at the California Department of Education, as well as the Executive Director of the Instructional Quality Commission. He and his team were the Sherpas that brought our 4-year and hundreds of 1,000 pages of public comment to make the California Mathematics Framework come to life. And the two of us were very fortunate to be able to stand together before the state board to ask for the adoption. Mike is also such an enormous figure, not only in all things curriculum and instruction, but specifically in mathematics. As a former mathematics teacher, just like myself, he is on the advisory board of the CalMSCS that we'll talk about a little bit later, and his staff is deeply involved in all of this work. And so together we want to bring to you just the work that we've been doing collectively with our partners all across the state. So to get us started, Mary shared the outcomes, and I'll just give you a moment to review them. And I like to start with a metaphor, with some storytelling, with a little bit to think about as we begin. So folks often ask me, ask Mike, ask our colleagues, just which textbooks should they adopt if they want to transform their mathematics program? Other times, people will turn to us and say, hey, what are the highest performing districts using? If we just use their textbooks, we should be able to, get the same kind of outcomes. And historically, this was a prevailing theory about the role of adoption. But I'm going to start with a metaphor. And in addition to being passionate about mathematics and education, I'm also a backpacker. And in my backpacking, I love to spend my time going into the wilderness, going to places that are undeveloped to really see things in their natural habitat. I love wildlife, I love outdoors, but I'm not that great at getting pictures from my trips. On the other hand, I am truly mesmerized by the beauty, the wonder, the awe that talented photographers can capture with their cameras. So there's a few that I follow on social media. And one is this young photographer named Isaac Spots, and he has a website called Isaac's Pics where he just captures beauty and amazing pictures from all over our national parks and from far off places that I've been to, but maybe haven't seen. I also have a friend, he is our fire public information officer, who is also a photographer, who captures pictures in my own county of Santa Barbara, from the city to the harbor to the Santa Ynez Valley, our Channel Islands, Summerlin beaches, the Gaviota Coast, and even Figueroa Mountain. So I look at these amazing things and I wonder, well, could I do that? If somebody would just tell me what is the best camera, I'm sure that I could make this happen as well. And so if I were to be able to look at something like Wirecutter, that we just say, here's all of the best and worst cameras. Or if I simply buy the same camera that Mike or Isaac used, I should be able to get the same outcomes, right? Well, this sounds silly because you all know the additional elements that are required in order to capture that level of beauty. And so what we say in mathematics about high quality instructional materials is that they are necessary, but not sufficient for building a high quality mathematics program. And in fact, the research from Harvard that came out about a decade ago describes what we call the instructional core. And the instructional core says this is really at the heart of any kind of improvement in education. It is the interaction among the students and the level of student engagement with the teacher's knowledge and skill, and the rigor, the relevance, and the complexity of the content that students are engaged in. And you see there at the center is this idea of mathematical tasks, or just in general of tasks. The tasks are what the students are actually asked to do day after day after day in the classroom that builds their knowledge, their understanding, their sense of identity, perseverance, and who they are as learners. And so the real accountability is in those tasks. But moreover, what Elmore and Title and City and Fireman from Harvard recognized is that if you want to improve learning at scale, and in this case, mathematical learning at scale, it requires changes to the instructional core. But here's the thing. When you change one element, you have to change the other two. So for example, if we increase teachers' instructional knowledge and skill, then the way students interact is going to change as well. When we increase the complexity of the content that students learn, teachers have to act differently around that content and change the way that students engage with it. And you can see how all these three things interact with each other. And so when we talk about the instructional materials, yes, they are essential to this, but they do not transform by themselves the teacher's knowledge and skill, student engagement, content rigor, and relevance. Mike?
Thank you for that, Ellen. And absolutely, the instructional material program, and that's one reason I love Ellen's story about the photographer and the camera is the instructional material program is just one piece. And it's really important for the user to identify what is it that they currently know, what is their baseline, what else do they need to know in order to be able to utilize that instructional material program to its maximum. Is it too complex? Is it not complex enough in certain areas? What are the specific needs of the school district? And there's a lot of different considerations. Even though you may have the same tool as another district, there may be different outcomes. And some of that may be aligned to what Ellen is talking about here with those the efforts to change scale and all the different things that need to happen.
Absolutely. We saw during the last adoption where sometimes districts chose a curriculum that had increased content rigor, but they didn't change teachers' knowledge and skill, nor the instructional methods, and the materials just were not successful. And so that leads to this quote that comes from chapter 10, page 40, lines 1004 through 1012. And we'll continue to take you through chapter 10 and other chapters throughout. But it says that teachers perform incredibly complex work that relies on thousands of instructional decisions every day. That comes from Deborah Ball's research. They need to understand their students' thinking. They have to choose tasks, decide which questions to pose in discussion, select which and whose lines of inquiry to pursue in the class, and ensure that tasks and content text are authentic and culturally relevant for students.
When educational partners and influencers outside of the classroom are not aligned, for example, when a textbook does not align with the vision of classroom instruction, the work of teaching is made even more difficult, and improvement in instructional practice is impeded.
So we've tried to establish the groundwork for why it doesn't start with the adoption, but we do want to say a little bit about the adoption process.
And with that, we're going to just very briefly show you some adoption highlights for the 2025 mathematics instructional materials adoption, which we're so very excited for. And we're well on our way to planning that adoption. On this slide, you see the reviewer application period occurred this year from April to September. We're currently in the process of vetting those applications and getting them ready for the Instructional Quality Commission to consider those applications for both instructional material reviewers and content review experts, to which they will then make recommendations to the State Board of Education for consideration in January of 2025. Once those reviewers are locked in, we'll then hold our reviewer training week in April here in Sacramento. The publishers will submit their instructional material programs for review by May 7th of 2025. And then from that point forward, reviewers will spend hundreds and hundreds of quality hours reviewing the many instructional materials programs that have been submitted for review. They'll reconvene in July to conduct deliberations and talk about their findings, talk about the evaluation process, what were some takeaways, what were some strengths of programs, what were some areas of growth, at which point a report will be provided to the Instructional Quality Commission in September of 2025, and then ultimately State Board of Education adoption in November of 2025. It's a long, lengthy process, extremely thorough, extremely important for all of our reviewers to be able to look at all of those programs. So along with that, I'd like to share do some myth busting, if you will. There's a lot of misconceptions about a statewide adoption. And so what I've listed here are some facts that are contrary to some popular belief. So the state level adoption process, through that process, it is rigorous, and we ensure that a publisher's program addresses all of the grade level content, all of the standards, and is aligned to the framework. And in this case, for the mathematics framework, does it organize standards within major conceptual ideas or the big ideas? Is the program built to provide for the needs of all learners, like in category 4, meeting the needs of learners in our evaluation criteria? Are there assessments that are usable? Are there instructions for teachers in order to utilize the program? Are all the supports being provided for all learners, like multilingual learners? So very important stuff. Math Framework Evaluation Criteria, Chapter 13 is comprehensive. It's rigorous. That's where the evaluation criteria comes from. And so that's a very important tool for local school boards and local district leaders to take a look at. This is the rubric that's going to be utilized when conducting an instructional materials adoption. So that's where that can be found. Another common myth is that a school district has to use programs that are on the State Board of Education adopted list, and that's a myth. They can and they likely will, because of the highly rigorous process that's utilized in order to evaluate these instructional materials. That's not to discount all the work that goes into it. However, if there's another program that, based on local need and the local control formulas and everything that's been identified as priorities for the district, a program that seems to fit that need and is not on the adopted list, then the school district can easily make that selection and evaluate that instructional material program in much the same way that the state conducts its own evaluation of instructional materials programs. Another myth is that curriculum developers have submitted all of their programs for review, and that's just not the case. There may be programs that curriculum developers have created that are very specific and very targeted, and that are not going to be part of a statewide adoption. And so those are things to consider with mathematics moving forward. And then lastly, LEAs must consider how materials will or will not meet the needs of local educators, because remember, it's the educators that are going to be utilizing these. What is their baseline? What is their comfort level? What kind of supports do they need? The students, and then regardless of list status. So those are common myths that I'd like to help dispel here. So moving on, I'd like to talk about the adoption role of a local school board. So based on Education Code, Section 240 states that local school boards are required to adopt instructional materials in accordance with the provisions of Section 60040, and that piece of Ed Code is about social content, to make sure that there is equal representation throughout instructional materials program of the contributions of all individuals, regardless of gender, regardless of race, ethnicity, etc., that there is that equal representation of individuals, so that students can see themselves, which we'll see as a recurring theme later on as we talk about equity in the mathematics framework. And also, Ed Code Section 60002 then stipulates that every school district board will provide for substantial teacher involvement in the selection of instructional materials, that teachers will be part of that decision-making process, and that the district board will promote the involvement of parents and other members of the community in the selection of instructional materials. So it's not just a decision to be made within a black box, so to speak, that there are interest holders that do need to be involved in the instructional material evaluation process. So with that, we're going to move into the next section of our presentation, orienting you to the structure and the features and organizing concepts of the mathematics framework. As Ellen mentioned, the 1,000 pages of that amazing guidance that was adopted by State Board in 2023. With that, I'm going to pass the presentation over to Ellen.
Thank you, Mike. And just as you said about the importance of boards and local governance teams, including the teachers, including the community, including families, we truly believe that the mathematics framework is that third point, is the resource, is the place to go for supporting that process that you can come together. And so with that, I want to start with my favorite quote, which is on page 2 of the mathematics framework. This amazing quote by Francis Su really frames our feelings about mathematics, about the framework, and about this process that you're about to embark on. And it says, a society without mathematical affection is like a city without concerts, parks, or museums. To miss out on mathematics is to live without an opportunity to play with beautiful ideas and to see the world in a new light. And that has been my experience, my lifetime, in being able to be in now my 39th year in mathematics education. And so with that, I want to also connect back to this, because through this quick overview, very surface level, we hope to help you know where the mathematics framework helps to have that conversation about changing the instructional core, changing these elements, increasing teachers' instructional knowledge and skills, increasing the level of complexity of the content, and changing the role of the student in the instructional process. And so for that, I want to start with, this is the overview. These are the chapters. And at the end of the presentation, you have links to go to the math framework. Many of you might be there already. And each of these chapters can be thought about in chunks. Chapters 1 and 2 are the introduction and provide the entire framework upon which the other 4 chunks are built. In chapters 3, 4, and 5, we see an in-depth progression across TK-12. And that's progression of how different ideas in mathematics, concepts, and skills develop in some areas that really matter to people, like number sense and reasoning, as well as the new area of data science. And then you have 3 grade band chapters, the TK5, which is actually broken up into TK2 and 3-5, and then middle school and high school, and some in-depth supports, systems, and structures, followed by the resources, a glossary, and 3 very useful appendices that we'll talk about. But where we're going to focus is on chapters 1 and 2. I'm going to take you into the highlights of chapter 1, and Mike will take you into chapter 2. I really see chapter 1 as getting to the content, that first lens that you have to develop when you are looking at any adoption process. But the new framework really makes it just so helpful in many ways. So let me get after it. So in chapter 1, this is the table of contents, and you'll see that these line numbers are there for now in the current version that is online. It makes finding things a lot easier. And after you see the areas about why we would learn math, how students learn math, and our commitment to equitable access, you see these 2 things: the why, the what, and the how of mathematics, as well as the big ideas, 2 of the newest features and the design principles for the rest of the framework. So this diagram that you see on the left, we often refer to it with its very technical term, the swirly diagram, lays out the why, the how, and the what of mathematics. The why are the 3 drivers of investigation. That's new. The how are the standards for mathematical practice, or the SMPs. These are part of the Common Core State Standards, the California standards that were adopted in 2010, and they've remained consistent, but they haven't really been elevated in practice to the extent that they could be. And finally, the what? The content connections that help to create coherence. So breaking those down, the why, the three drivers of investigation are really the reasons that make mathematics relevant to students. The three things that we do with mathematics are make sense of the world, predict what could happen, and impact the future. The drivers of investigation are there to elicit curiosity and motivate students to engage deeply with authentic mathematics. They aim to provide a reason to care about the mathematical work they are doing and to ground all of us in our why. Second, we have the standards for mathematical practice. These 8 standards for mathematical practice start in TK and go all the way through grade 12. As you look at them, I'm certain that these are the things that you really want to instill in all of the students, all of the children in your life, and are essential to your work, no matter what field you are in. I'll give you a moment to look at those and review them. And those mathematical practices really embed the habits of mind and the habits of interaction that form the basis for all of math learning. Because we believe that to teach mathematics for understanding, it is absolutely essential to actively and intentionally cultivate students' use of the standards for mathematical practice and be very transparent with them that this is what mathematicians do, that this is the residue of mathematics that endures. They must be taught carefully and practiced as intentionally as the content standards. In a sense, they are two halves of a powerful whole. So we had the why, the how, and then ultimately the what. We know that there are hundreds of standards for mathematics, content standards, that change and grow over the different grade levels. But these are the 4 things that all of mathematics, the 4 organizing categories for all TK-12 math content. And they are the understanding, skills, and dispositions of all the content that students will learn in school mathematics. So the first is about reasoning with data, exploring changing quantities, taking wholes apart and putting parts together, and discovering shape and space. So as you think about all of the things you know about mathematics, whether it's fractions or geometry or functions or areas under the curve, they all exist within these 4 areas, which then leads to the other important feature of Chapter 1, which is planning around and teaching to the big ideas. This diagram here is the big ideas for kindergarten. And what you'll see is each of these concepts, they fit under those content connections, but these are the enduring understandings, the focus areas for what we're doing in kindergarten. And these big ideas are really important because truly what learning is for students, and especially learning mathematics, is not that it's a linear form of skills, but students who really succeed in mathematics view mathematics as a vibrant, interconnected, beautiful, relevant, and creative set of ideas. And this comes from Chapter 2 of the mathematics framework. But really, when we look at students who are learning mathematics, they are constantly deconstructing and reconstructing that internal web of ideas in their heads. And not only are students doing that, But that's work that mathematics teachers do too. They're constantly thinking about how these concepts and ideas of mathematics can expand, contract, and connect not only within their grade level, but across grade levels. And that's where it's really exciting to see how the focus of the content has come forth from these 4 content connections that expand into the big ideas at each grade. And then take a step further where each of those are then aligned to the standards. So one of the important things that we can see is that engaging deeply with understanding what are students supposed to know and be able to do is essential and is an essential lens to looking at our adoptions. Because one of the things we saw in the last framework, the standards for the California mathematics standards were adopted. It's crazy that I remember this, but August 2nd, 2010. And at the last math framework, it was released 3 years later. Many of the textbooks that followed that kind of reused previously developed content and in a sense matched it to the standards without necessarily attending to the developmental process. Our collective knowledge and understanding of the progressions and the trajectories was nascent at that time. And so one of the things we have the chance to do this time is to engage with these big ideas and the understanding that the progressions are essential precursors to choosing materials that support these developmental trajectories. I'm just going to give you a quick glimpse of some of the screenshots that I took out of chapters 6, 7, and 8 to really show how a local education agency, whether it's a really large district, a charter school, a county office of education, can look at the development of these big ideas across grade levels and across courses in high school to really understand how are we going to look at content. Because as we change the complexity of the content that students learn by looking at the big ideas, by engaging in the big, in these mathematical progressions while engaging in the practices, we will have the foundations for building your district, your charter's vision for high quality mathematics. These will be essential lenses for any adoption screening process. And so, as we've said, if we change one dimension, we have to change the others. So Mike's going to give us a brief overview of how Chapter 2 illuminates the content, or I'm sorry, the student engagement and the teacher knowledge and skill.
Thank you so much, Ellen. This framework is so very powerful in the sense that it provides this hope that there can be this dynamic change moving forward in mathematics teaching and learning across the state. I always like to throw out some numbers, and that reminder is that 34% of students based on test scores are proficient or exceeds proficiency in mathematics across the state. That's 34%. That's 1 in 3 students are proficient. The reverse of that is that 2 out of every 3 students are not proficient in mathematics. And this framework seeks to try to make a major change in that. Previous frameworks focused on really, this is how you teach to the standards. This framework is very inclusive of equity and engagement of all students. And Chapter 2 is really the start of that. It's very easy for educators to get stuck into a deficits mindset of students. What is it that students don't have? And so target that. That's what we're going to teach to, because we want to fill those gaps. The framework seeks to do the opposite of that. It follows an assets-based approach to instruction in the sense of what are students bringing in with them? What do they have? What can we build off of? What experiences do they have and understand and can form strong connections to in mathematics, and then build on those in teaching and learning through multiple strategies, including active engagement, through investigation, through building on a student's inherent curiosity. And hopefully before they get to that point where I saw, and Ellen has seen as math teachers, students who are like, I've never been good at math. I'm just not a math person, and they become programmed in that. This framework seeks to do the opposite of that and help students build that curiosity, help them form that positive relationship with mathematics through their own internalization of that curiosity and building on that, and then bringing in cultural and personal relevance into the teaching and learning. Students who can see themselves, and we say this in all content areas, but even more so in mathematics, where we're at that 2 out of every 3 students deficit, bring in their own life experiences, make things real for students, and have them see themselves in teaching and learning. So on the next slide, there's a listing of the 5 different, the 3 dimensions of systemic change, and then the 5 components of equitable and engaging teaching. So chapter 2 expands upon these components that were then mentioned in chapter 1 to encourage equitable outcomes and active student engagement for all students, to teach 2 big ideas so that there's this interconnectedness between content that students are learning, to use open-ended tasks, not just the drill and kill mentality that many of us had grown up with, but really to urge that thinking and that critical thinking, teaching for social justice, and then inviting students' questions and conjectures, and prioritizing reasoning and justification. So all of these combined, these 5 components of equitable and engaging teaching, will help to then increase student engagement in math so that students can then see themselves as mathematically capable individuals, and hopefully so that when they do go to that math classroom on the first day of school, they're not already walking through the door defeated, saying, okay, here we go, another year of math, but rather the opposite of that, being excited about mathematics, excited about being sparking their curiosity about math, and seeing those connections between and progressions between one content area, one topic to another, which then takes us into chapters 3, 4, and 5. Extremely important. They have their own chapters. In previous frameworks, we focused just on grade levels, but chapter 3, the focus on numeracy, the focus on these foundational skills of number sense, and how important it is in early learning, and then moving that through education, through middle school, through high school. Chapter 4 talks about exploring, discovering, reasoning, provides some context around utilizing the standards for math practice, and discussing how those elementary, middle, and high school teachers can teach to the big ideas that are found in more depth later on in chapters 6, 7, and 8. That you'll see it here at the bottom of the slide. And then chapter 5 talks about the mathematical foundations of data science, because really we're talking about trying to make math real and applicable. And I sure wish I had 10 cents for every student that asked me, when am I going to use this in real life, Mr. Torres? That just told me I wasn't teaching to real life. And chapter 5 talks about data literacy, data science, the understanding of the world around us, making sense of numbers, making sense of data, identifying misleading pieces of data, using data to make decisions about important skills in their roles as global citizens. So all of those very important chapters as we move the needle on mathematics. And then chapters 6, 7, and 8 are, we lovingly call our grade band chapters. Chapter 6 focuses on elementary school, transitional kindergarten through grade 5, and puts all of these things into practice. What does it look like when you use content connections, drivers of investigation within the context of a standard for math practice, and then align to the big ideas so that there's this coherent teaching of similar major conceptual ideas, this grouping of topics. Chapter 7 does the same for middle school. Chapter 7 is that pivotal grade level or grade band where students are then gearing up and getting ready for what higher math classes they're going to be taking later on in their math careers, whether understanding where their interests lie, and if they're going to be taking Algebra 1 as an accelerated course in middle school to be able to reach as high as they need to go, which may potentially be calculus in high school. Chapter 7 talks about those and the best strategies in teaching middle school. And then chapter 8 talks specifically about the high school pathways and addresses ways in which students can accelerate, ways in which students can form a pathway to their post-school outcomes, whatever those may be. And then moving on to, so this kind of sums it up, this slide that you have here, integrating chapters 1 through 5 in that context of the grade level bands of 6 through 8, and incorporating meeting the needs of all learners, whether it's through universal design for learning, making learning inclusive for all students, meeting the needs of diverse learners, whether they're multilingual learners, students with disabilities. And then there's a plethora of examples that we call snapshots and vignettes that are available through these chapters that show specific examples. So it's not an actual curriculum per se in this framework, but providing examples of these best practices that then educators and curriculum developers can then utilize to create programs and create lessons that are engaging of all students and meets the needs of all learners. So there we have it. Ellen did a fantastic job of talking about chapter 1. I talked a bit about chapter 2 and the equity, the access of the framework for all learners for equitable and engaging teaching. And then lastly, I did talk about those vignettes, those examples. There are smaller vignettes scattered throughout the framework and all of the different chapters, specifically in chapters 6, 7, and 8 for the different grade level bands. But the much longer examples of these teaching strategies are then combined into Appendix C that illustrate these instructional shifts and the framework components that we've talked about. So with that, I'm going to take us back to Ellen for the third and final section of our presentation, the role of the school board. So you're sitting here listening to this webinar on the math framework, and now you're geared up. I know you are. Now you're ready. You're ready to make effective change in mathematics teaching and learning. And you're like, well, wait a minute. The adoption, Torres, isn't until November 2025. But there's work to be done. And that's what Ellen's going to be sharing here in the role of the school board in supporting conditions for improvement and implementation.
Great, thank you. So many of you are probably familiar with the results pyramid, or this particular one from Culture Partners. And at its heart, it says in the pyramid you see on the left that the results that you get currently, or that we're getting currently as a state within our local education agencies, is a result of the experiences that lead to the beliefs that impact the actions that create the results. And if we want to get different results, we can't get new results if we haven't changed the culture. And hopefully what we've given you by this whirlwind tour of the math framework is some of the tools that will help to do that. And so you're asking yourself, yeah, but how do I, as a school board member, not in the classroom, not on the sites, how do I, in my board or governance team role, do that? And really, I think what's most important, as Mike said, is supporting the collaboration among all educational partners to address the instructional, structural, and cultural dimensions of the district vision for mathematics. Visioning isn't just taking something and making a nice little statement, but the hard work of visioning requires struggle and work together. And the way that we think that you can ready yourself is by digging in a little bit more into chapter 10. So we're giving you homework, and you need to, no, just kidding. You need to turn it in to Mike, not me. But in chapter 10, you really see the in-depth supports. And so we're going to start with the part that starts on line 761, and Mike will read it to you.
So school boards working within their responsibilities play an important role in supporting administrators and teachers to increase instructional knowledge and skills. When the board aligns its governance responsibilities and focuses on goals to increase students' mathematical understanding and success, district structures and resources strengthen administrative leadership.
Thank you. And there's just a few call outs here of the ways in chapter 10 that boards can truly support the administrators to lead and to operationalize the vision in the California mathematics framework. So you can see leadership beliefs, policies, practices around instruction. Some of these are going to have to change. Some of the stated things about fidelity to the curriculum or I do, you do, we do are contraindicated in building reasoning. There's also program level considerations that the community has to engage in together. There's some system coherence and mathematical progressions that have to be looked at as an entire system, and some analysis of program structures and course-taking patterns. It's also important, and the boards play an essential role in engaging family, partners, and communities in this process together. And then we want to tell you a little bit about the California Math, Science, Computer Science Initiative that is here to support, that is happening right now. The CalMSCS initiative is a grant that Mike and I are both very, very involved in. And the goal is to develop and expand our support structures statewide for coherence. These are some of the key institutions and agencies that are involved. The California County Superintendents, the California Mathematics Project, the California Math Council, the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, and of course, our amazing Department of Education, our CDE. And together, what we have done is to build in each county a connection to both local communities of practices and a statewide community of practice, because we know that we had to get support in your local communities. So your county offices of education are convening local communities of practice, bringing in the partners from the Math Project, from all of these areas to develop tools and networks for doing this work. Many have been doing this work already, and they're able to now expand their networks. And so all of this, you can reach out to us for more information about this, but we want to bring all of that together to emphasize, as Mike said, the time to start is not November of 2025. The time to start is now. And so these last two things that we want to bring are what you need to prioritize and what you need to acknowledge. So prioritizing.
We want to make sure that professional learning occurs before starting the adoption, because remember, the mathematics framework is 1,000 pages. There's a lot to it, and it can be inundating to get a whole new instructional material program and not have any background knowledge or any level setting that had occurred prior to decision time to adopting an instructional program.
And also prioritizing this time to use the framework to develop the district, the LEA's mathematics vision. And one of the things we know is there's just immense turnover in our teaching and our administrative profession. So even if you've done visioning in the past, now is the perfect time, not just for overall visioning, but to use this to have those difficult conversations. So prioritizing the professional development and then acknowledging these two things.
And also acknowledging that there's the time that's necessary to be able to afford to school districts, to staff, to school sites, the resources that are required, and then the supports that they'll need in order to be able to implement this this shift in mathematics teaching and learning and get us to move that needle on mathematics teaching and learning.
This is deeply human work. And whenever we talk about work that is transformational, we know it's relational and not transactional. Those relationships take time, and you also have the opportunity to communicate that you have a sustained commitment to your teachers, to your administrators, to your community for mathematics. And so with that, we want to say thank you and turn it back to Mary to facilitate our questions and answers.
Well, thank you so much, Ellen and Mike. You did a wonderful job, I think, laying out the conceptual understanding and kind of pointing our members in the direction of, next steps for what might be useful in supporting districts and county offices as we think about not just November of 2025, but in the months ahead. Right now, I want to ask folks if they have any questions that they would like to ask our esteemed panelists. You can go ahead and type that into the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. In the meantime, I want to ask a few questions that I think might be relevant to the governance team members that have joined us for this conversation. One thing I want to take is your point about developing a shared vision and understanding of the math framework and the key concepts within, and what math instruction should look like at the local level. And I'm wondering if you have any advice to board members about what that process might look like in terms of developing a shared understanding. What might those conversations look like? How might a district approach that development of a shared understanding?
I'll start off, Mike, and then you can add. This is some work that actually many of our county offices have been taking teams through. And developing your shared vision starts with taking stock of your current reality. And that's looking at all the different types of data, not only quantitative data about student performance and course taking and looking at all of the artifacts of mathematics and how students progress and proceed through, but also taking stock of how long people have been in your system and what are some of the things that they are seeing. And what we often call is street data, where we do empathy interviews with students, or we get from the administrators who are on the ground, that we hear from parents, that we hear from community members. So starting with all of that data, but then going into the use of the framework is there as a third point to have conversations so that folks can come together and make meaning of, here's our current state. What does our desired state look like? And then how do we look at the causes or the artifacts and the mindsets that have created our current state? What are the assets we can build upon within our families, within our communities, within our teachers, within our administrators, to start to operationalize that vision? So that's part of the work that that different county offices are going to be reaching out and building that ability within the leaders of your districts. And so, without giving you here is all the steps in doing it, that's kind of the overview. Mike, what would you say and add to
Yeah,
that?
I just wanted to also add that although the framework is 1,000 pages long and has this huge paradigm shift in teaching and learning, and it does represent the best practices since the previous framework in 2013. And so it is highly possible that there are some of these strategies already being implemented locally, either at a district level or at a school site level or a team level for that matter, grade level team for that matter. So I think taking that stock, that street level data that Ellen, you were talking about is so important is what are we already doing? Finding, where are we at? Where are our educators at to help them identify where are the opportunities? And that can also help in developing that vision of what elements now do we want to pull out from the mathematics framework? What audiences what specific student groups do we want to specifically target? What grade levels do we want to target? And then invest that, as we mentioned, the time, the resources, and the support there in order to improve those outcomes.
Those are both very helpful answers. I want to also call back to something that Mike, you shared earlier in the presentation. You did some myth busting. And I think that when the draft mathematics framework was being considered, both by the Instructional Quality Commission as well as the state board, there was a lot of feedback from the community during that period of review and consideration. And some of it may have been based on some misunderstandings of the framework. And I think that board members have sometimes encountered some of those misunderstandings during public board meetings. I'm wondering if you had a moment to kind of think about some of the common points of questions that they might be receiving from the public, if you want to do a little additional myth busting for us.
Sure. Yeah, I think, and that's a great question. The first and foremost, the biggest thing that does come to mind is the myth that the approved version of the math framework says students should not take Algebra 1 in middle school, and that is not the message in the mathematics framework. In fact, the message of the approved version is actually quite the opposite, is that students can take courses and go as far and as deep into mathematics as they would like, as they need within their mathematics journey. So if that means taking Algebra 1 in the middle school setting, then yes, then that is a pathway. The pathway does include having a student complete their mathematics learning journey at calculus at grade 12. So that is another myth, that calculus is gone and off the table. So those are two of the major myths that I'd like to
I'll add a third.
Yes.
There was a myth that the framework does not emphasize fluency. And you can go right to chapter 3, and it is very clear the importance of fluency with mathematics. The outcome and the goal of fluency is and has always been there. What the math framework shows is different ways to get to fluency through understanding and building on that fluency as something that is deepened over a student's over time. Very clearly, the math framework stresses fluency.
And so I know we have a lot of seasoned mathematics educators or board members who have followed mathematics education in their tenure, but just a quick definition of fluency in the mathematical sense for others in our audience who might not be as familiar with the term.
So fluency refers to the automaticity with which students know their mathematics facts and their relationship. as well as their fluency with procedural, with procedures in the various operations, adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing, etc. So yes, mathematical fluency is about automaticity and speed without needing to count, but being able to do it quickly and accurately so as not to use a lot of the working memory, and being able to move on to more complex mathematics.
Thank you. That's very helpful. We have a question that mentions the fact that CBEST testing for teachers is not sufficient to assess teacher mathematical content knowledge. And so the question is, what can be done to provide particularly elementary school teachers with preparation and understanding of math concepts so they have a strong sense of efficacy in teaching a lot of the core concepts?
Yeah, this is really important. And I really appreciate that question, because there is not sufficient time and focus in our, the CBEST doesn't, determine mathematical knowledge for teaching. And developing that is something that has to be a commitment of school districts over time, because the ways in which teachers understand mathematics for teaching it is a little bit different and over and above what you need to know and how you need to know mathematics simply to do it. And so that's where I feel like the big ideas become that starting point, but there are all kinds of workshops and professional learning provided by the county offices of education, through CMC, through the California Math Project, in relation to the mathematics that teachers are teaching, in order to develop that. So that commitment to understanding that being able to do the mathematics is necessary but not sufficient, to being able to think about how it develops in young minds. That's the ongoing commitment to the professional learning that the book alone will not do for you. So starting with the big ideas and doing the needs assessment from there.
Thank you. We have a question from a board member asking, what data tools are available for school boards to learn more about our current math scores?
So
yeah, go ahead, because it was just released.
The major data tool is access to test scores. So on the CASP, California Assessment for Student Performance and Progress website. So scores are available to take a look at, and there's different ways to present the data, to visualize it. You can do a comparison of California to your school district. You can do a comparison of your school district to a similar school district. I believe you could do multiple, up to 3 different comparisons on that web page. And so you can look at both English language arts scores and mathematics scores, as well as CAST, California Science Test scores on there. And so that's one that's readily and freely available. And then locally, school district leaders have access to scores and to make informed decisions at a local level for their own students. So that's not publicly available. It's available specifically to your local educational agency. Thank you.
We have another question going back to the idea of a shared vision. It was mentioned that districts should dedicate time toward creating a math vision. Is there a sample math vision that could be shared, or at least serve as a starting point or inspiration for those that are looking at tailoring it to their specific local context?
I don't have at the department, we don't have a specific example or template to be able to provide, because it is it would be a locally generated product.
You know, if you wanted, let me distinguish between a vision and visioning. The process of visioning is what really brings people together and creates that that thing that everybody can get behind. So you could go on ChatGPT or Claude or any of the AI tools right now and say, give me a vision for mathematics in California, and it would spit one out. So you can do that. But when we talk about visioning, it's going into all of those different areas about your mathematics program and how is it is experienced by students. So I also want to say I'm unable to type some of the answers in the Q&A. It's not letting me. So there's a question about, Tim had the question about automaticity, but not speed with fluency. Is that correct? Yes, that's great, Tim. Very clear that yes, as it becomes automatic, speed will come, but we're not trying to make kids super quick and fast. It's really, the automaticity is about knowing these things well enough and having the relationships, you know, like your automatic ways to make 10, for example, among first graders, that become so inherent in their understanding that it's part of what they can leverage for further understanding, and they aren't counting or weighed down by these things that take up a lot of their working memory. So thanks for that clarification.
We have another question that asks about if there's a resource hub that has been developed for school board members to use and lead the conversation along with the superintendent and cabinet, or if there are sample resolutions for boards. I'll start before Ellen and Mike chime in just to say that CSBA is in the process of pulling together a series of resources for our members, and we'll be doing that over the next year and a half through the support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But perhaps Ellen and Mike have some additional perspectives. We have not developed any sample resolutions at CSBA at this point. However, we have updated several of our sample math policies. In our most recent September packet for our Gamut subscribers, you'll see 3 either sample policies or administrative regulations that are related to mathematics instruction. So that's a starting point for us. And then what Ellen has just brought up for you is on this page, and again, you will receive a copy of our slides following this presentation. We have linked to our start of the Resource Hub, a page that we are placing all of our materials related to adopting instructional materials, and we'll have a hyperlink within them for you. But perhaps Ellen and Mike, you have also seen some resources specifically geared towards board members or sample resolutions.
I don't have sample resolutions. I think it's more about, you know, we just so appreciate this partnership with CSBA because we truly believe that as we all work together, every single member of the community, from the school boards and the local governance team, to the administrators, to the parents, to all of the community assets and resources, and all of those folks that were on that penultimate slide that I shared, that when we all come together in this pursuit, it is the act of working on this together that will do that. So we'll continue to contribute to the CSBA resource and to continue to invite school boards in our local areas. One of the places that you can always start is to go to your county superintendent of schools and your county office of education and to ask that the team there, every single member of CISC, the Curricular and Improvement Support Committee, would love to come and work with your school boards, to work with you and help to take this to the next step and help provide some of this guidance in the ways that is meaningful and suits your particular context.
And I
Thank you.
also want to take a moment to put in a plug. We didn't put it in the presentation, but I do want to put in a plug for a document called the Guidance for Local Instructional Materials Adoption. So it's not a resolution for school board members, but it's actually a guide for local usage. Either at the school district or the school board members is more than welcome to take a look at the document that provides the best practices on conducting a local adoption and all the things that go along with it. What are the different considerations, many of which we talked about during this presentation, whether it's bringing in community partners, whether it's is providing professional learning support for your educators. And then the framework itself provides some of that guidance as well. There's a whole professional learning chapter within the mathematics framework, as well as an assessment chapter that may be of help in reference.
That's really nice. That resource, I think, also has some good guidance for school boards in LEAs that are considering adopting something that the state hasn't necessarily approved as part of the curriculum, because again, you're still required to meet some basic requirements, both in terms of social content standards as well as the content standards themselves. And so really helping boards that are looking at materials that are off of the list that is adopted through the state. And that is a helpful guide. We had another question around whether or not materials have to be in Spanish to be approved by the CDE. I think more broadly, we could talk about, languages that are represented within a particular LEA's community. And if so, what percentage of materials must be available to be approved?
That's a really good question. And so I think, as you mentioned, what it really does boil down to is what are the local needs of the school district, and to internally make that decision of what percent of the instructional material program should be in a specific language and in what languages.
Yeah, I think that becomes especially important if you have a dual language immersion program, if you have a bilingual program, and if mathematics is one of the subjects, depending on your different grade levels, that is taught in Spanish or in an additional language. And so that would be definitely one of the local factors that you would use in choosing the instructional materials that work best for you.
We have another question from someone who will be participating in the CalMSCS, MSCS, and they wanted to just kind of check in to see if they will be provided with additional guidance or resources for the adoption.
Absolutely. I love that question, Alma. And so, yes, because we have a statewide community of practice where we are starting with the framework, and we are simultaneously working on an adoption toolkit. What happens at each of the individual counties, at the local communities of practice, is that some of those things are already happening around specifically the math framework and then into the adoption. And so we have a multi-year approach to this so that when districts start, whether they start now or they start a little bit later, we have ways of supporting not only the adoption, but all of these things that we've talked about today. So thanks for that question, and thanks for being part of CalMSCS.
Great. And we had another question to the issue of mathematical progressions or pathways. And that is, the concept of where do AP or IB math curricula and pathways fit into the framework?
A great question. So Chapter 8 is a great resource which talks about the mathematics pathways at the high school level. And So there's this beautiful figure, this beautiful chart that lists some of the different potential courses and within some different pathways that can be available for students. It would be no different in AP calculus class would fall under the calculus listing under that chart. So I highly recommend taking a look at that resource and seeing where these courses do fit in. I think it would also depend on like what is the description of the course and what is its equivalency. So things to consider when taking a look at the pathways chart.
Mhm.
Thank you. This kind of is a nice refresher question for some of the presentation that we had earlier today. But the question is, how should curriculum look different in the past from in the past based on the big ideas in the framework? So I know that the framework, we're talking 1,000 pages, but if you could kind of distill it down to a few key things, that would be helpful.
People ask great questions. So, you know, one of the things to know too is the current instructional materials that are out here really range in their approach, in when they were created. So there's not a Boolean, these are the old and these are the new. There's almost a progression that has happened, and that will continue to be there. So I'll answer that question in terms of what might be some of the look-fors and what are some of the things that you will want to make sure are a match between the development that you've done and what is there. And one is this idea of teaching to big ideas. Instead of each page is a standard or a skill, you're going to see that it's not necessarily on the lesson by lesson explicit skill. You know, many of us who maybe did the Dulciani back from our algebra days, set A, set B, set C, you know, where you did a thing to death each day. But that's not to say that there isn't practice, but instead that all of these elements that we talked about the, you know, the 5 components, you're going to see a lot more open tasks, what we call low floor, high ceiling tasks that allow for the teacher and provide support for the teacher to engage the class in mathematical investigation, in discourse, in meaning making. There's also going to be an emphasis on those big ideas and helping students understand how the mathematics connects, not only across content and concepts, but also across years and how it connects to what they already know. There's so many ways that we teach, you know, multiplication very differently when we're looking at whole numbers than when we're looking at fractions and decimals and polynomials. And yet there's this opportunity to connect all of those things and build that across. So you're looking not only across the trajectory of all of the grades, but then within the grades. You're also looking at the things laid out in chapter 4 about support for multilingual learners and discourse and inclusion and meaning making. So, you know, what I would say is once you engage in this work, you'll have these new lenses that will help. But I hope a few of those things that I've said make sense. I think it's also important to make sure that when you are looking at these instructional materials, you have a broad range of the folks who are going to be using them. And so that you know that the intent and the structures of how they're developed really meet the needs of your local context and the teachers in your system.
We have another really good question. I appreciate all of you that have stayed on this Zoom to the end. This is one that is really relevant for our board members across the state, and that is the fact that we anticipate a declining budget over the next few years with the loss of ESSER funding, with many districts that are facing declining enrollment and some uncertainty related to state revenues. So what do we know of, what should LEAs be thinking about in terms of investing in their adoption? And I would like to add to that question a little bit, because I think that part of what we've been emphasizing is also the professional learning that is associated with preparing for the adoption. So any thoughts on that?
I'll start with the professional learning, and then Mike, you can talk about what you are seeing, or what you know about the actual purchase of instructional materials. One of the things around the professional learning is, I didn't necessarily say this in the CalMSCS grant, but it is a grant, it is a contract, and there is money that supports the county office members, the folks coming and providing that support offset with these grant funds. But you do have the costs of substitutes and pulling people from their sites, or if you do this in the evening, if you do this work around the math visioning. So I would say that you don't have to pay for expensive consultants, but instead, the money, the commitment to the release time that's essential for folks to do this work and to do this work in community. And then Mike, do you want to say a little bit about the actual materials?
So based on our early estimates, so we're looking at potentially up to 60 new educational programs that are going to be up for review, which will make this the largest adoption that the state will be conducting. Hypothetically, then you'll have a very large list of instructional material programs to review and to consider. We don't know exactly the names of the programs or who the publishers are or the price points that are going to be involved. In fact, some of the next steps, and I just gave you the highlights of the schedule of the adoption, but one of the next major steps that we're looking at very intently on is in January, we're going to be holding for publishers an invitation to submit meeting to go over all the details about how to submit. And so there we'll get a better idea of which publishers are going to be participating. And then shortly after that meeting, we'll get an intent to submit forms submitted by each of the publishers. And that's when we'll definitively know which programs are being submitted, which one, and which publishers. So at this point, our early estimates are about 60 instructional material programs. And when I say that, one instructional material program could be kindergarten all the way to Algebra 1. So multi-grade level within it. So it's going to be pretty large, it's going to be pretty massive, but I can't anticipate how much the price point is going to be.
Great. Thank you. We have time for two more questions. I'm going to ask one that we have been hearing from our members, and that is related to the fact that mathematics instruction and education does not happen in a vacuum. We know that teachers and parents have all come to the table with a set of understandings about maybe what they think mathematics instruction is or should look like, and wondering if you have any feedback in terms of ways to help educate the community during this process, both from a faculty standpoint, but also families. We've all seen the social media videos of parents talking about new math, which I kind of think is funny because we've talked about new math since the 1970s in different iterations, but just curious in terms of recommendations for thinking about the conversations that are happening with the community along the way.
That's a huge question. And I am going to start by saying I am the child of a mathematician. My father was an algebraic topologist, a graph theorist, and spent 40, 50 years in the higher education system in various, all over from undergraduate to graduate, having graduate students. And I've been a mathematics educator for, as I was saying, I'm entering my 39th year. And those two things are both important here. Mathematics is one of the disciplines that is, by its very nature, the most equitable because the authority is within the discipline. When you put something out there mathematically, it is up for everybody to say, no, that doesn't make sense. Unlike, science, you get people to follow your theory, or history, you're the storyteller. Mathematics, the authority is in the discipline. But mathematics education is a little bit different because we're constantly trying to figure out the best way to make sure that every single child has access to our current collective human intellect and what we know about mathematics, and to know it in ways that they can push the edges of our collective understanding, or they can apply that mathematics in new ways that we could have never imagined to solve problems for the world. And so when we talk about, what's new and what's not new, I think it's really important to talk about that, and that we are constantly in a state of continuous improvement to take the research that we've seen, develop, but also put it into context and to constantly try it out and make sure that we haven't misinterpreted what the research has shown. We have to build this into our teachers. And I loved Donna's questions earlier, and really make sure that our teachers have a sense of agency and a relationship with mathematics that is not one of hierarchy, but one of inclusion. Because in order to get there, we have to model the fact that we are all trying to learn, trying to make sense of this collective body of knowledge while trying to figure out the best ways to do it. And our teachers, our administrators are our best bets, working alongside our researchers. That's why you see in our coherence and our CalMSCS, we've got our math project folks, we've got all of our university folks, we've got all of our community agencies and institutions where we're all trying to do this together. We may not agree at first or even at last of what the best way is, because all of our children are different, and the ways in which their minds make sense of this is going to vary. But we do know that all children can learn mathematics to really high levels. I've seen it in my career, and I am committed to it that all of our children can learn mathematics at even higher levels than we have done in the past. But we have to invest in our educators as well, and in the time, the resources, and the collective efforts to do this together.
I really appreciate that. And that segues into our final question for today. So you've been talking about the research. Mike earlier spoke to the recent release of test scores and the concerns around the fact that approximately 34% of California's students are proficient or above in mathematics. And so this question is, what is the research that undergirds the belief that teaching to big ideas will improve our outcomes for our students in terms of mathematics? And also, what studies show that teachers are capable of learning and practicing this new approach towards teaching?
I'd hate to sound a bit snarky, but the mathematics framework is, like we mentioned, it's 1,000 pages long. And so because of that, it's not just a listing of strategies. It actually is inclusive of the reasoning behind why these strategies are being recommended, why these strategies have been are part of the best practices, why they're considered best practices, how they've worked in other high-performing countries. So there's a lot of background within the mathematics framework, especially those early chapters that both Ellen and I started to talk about, that kind of laid the groundwork for the big ideas, that laid the groundwork for tapping into student curiosity and using the open-ended open-ended strategy of teaching and learning. So not to sound too snarky, but that math framework is available. It's available for download for free. And it's searchable. So I highly recommend going to the framework, specifically in the chapters that we provided. We touched just the tip of the iceberg in this presentation. And so highly recommend that all who's interested go and take a peek.
Thank you so much. So I believe we have just a couple of quick slides to show you. And again, as a reminder, you will have access to a recording of this presentation today, as well as the slides that will be sent as a PDF to you as well. But we want to thank you so much for your participation today. Alan and Mike, we really appreciate the time that you've put into providing both some of the conceptual understanding of the math framework and the adoption process, along with the school board role and how our members can really support an effective process over the next few years. Just want to point you to the fact that we have a resource page, a page for instructional materials adoption, and I believe that Ellen has also attached some additional resource links at the end of this slide deck. So thanks, everyone. We appreciate your participation and look forward to supporting you over the next few years in this process.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone, for attending.
Thank you, Mary.